completion.
Hours
The stopper does fit in there.
roll this
There's nothing special, it's just a test tube really. Yeah, so that would sit thinking something like that. I just realised, so just sort of made something up to make it sit nicely. But, yeah, that sits there, you know, in front of the lamp. We jug it on.
Good.
And let it run. I mean, this is what I sort of visualised the reactor would look like. So, you know, if it doesn't work, then it's a problem with my thinking, not so much the actual equipment. So, yeah, shit. So we have our solvent here. This is dichloromethane and methanol. A bit of a mixture. This is what comes straight out of the paint stripper. And so what I would usually do now is wash the dichloromethane, get rid of all the methanol, and then redistill. But thinking about doing this with plastic, using this as is, because we could probably use dichloromethane or methanol for our solvent with UV reaction. So a mix of it is fine. So we don't need to purify it further than this. There's a little bit of water at the top. Right. So, it should be dry enough. Dry, I think. Take some solvent in the middle. Probably end up using 5 mils of solvent for about half a gram of solvent. That's about the ratio that you use. 1 kilo, 10 litres of solvent.
Sin.
Quite a bit. But one thing the mixture, the solid's pretty precious, so I don't want it boiling off or getting ruined. I want to test how much heat we're producing. Because if it gets really hot,
Eating flies doesn't count as running the sandwich,
then we can
right?
just leave it on for all the time and it won't take nearly as long. I might just put 5 mils of solvent in there, that
Grab
in
some.
there and just see how hot it gets. 5 mils of
That's not.
container claims is totally different. So maybe I'll set up a test just do half the concentration. For illuminating
It's for the
a
plants.
large area, then maybe a lower concentration will help anyway, potentially. So we'll put 10 mils in one solvent to burn for a change. Not the best of setups, but it is floating in there in front of the lamp. So let's chuck it on.
It's definitely these two! It's these two! No! It's these two! It's these two! Help! Oh, I found imposters! I found the imposters! I found them!
You ever just warmed
I found the
up
imposters!
locked on solvent?
I don't want to remove it! I won't tell anybody! I won't tell anybody! Just let me do it.
Alright, 30 minutes later. What? I mean, the heat coming off the land. Feel that.
Emergency! Emergency meeting! Emergency meeting!
Keep it going. You run it for less than half an hour. So we're
Wait a second.
also, people will probably comment, hey, just use sunlight. But I hate to inform you, but it does actually rain here sometimes too, and it's not always sunny. It's the middle of winter here currently. I was walking. I don't think it's sunny the weekend. This is rainy week. Once a year, we have a couple days of rain, and then rain here. Sunlight, sorry, but fucking had rain and yellow. 1 week.
Get my camera. They were chasing me around, screaming at me. They were like, yeah, don't tell anybody. I was like, fucking life, my life is screaming.
That's how the game's
I went to go to
played.
their place, and they both got like weirdly the triangle.
Slightly warmer.
I'm sitting there going like,
Not really.
I'm like, why are they doing this?
Ooh, there's the-
So it has to be. It's once again cardboard
Sort of
and film.
shielding is
I was
hot.
being
No,
chased.
That's good.
no real warmer than the outside temperature. Salt level's pretty good, so it stops it. Doesn't really look like the right size stopper. This is the stopper I got sent
No, don't
with it.
skip. I'm telling you, they chased me around.
It's that. Yeah, I've greased this stopper as well. Alright, well, there's nothing to complain about now. Definitely do 90 minutes, 2 hours. Time, probably longer, without worrying about heating up, solvent loss and all that. So, good, yeah, good. Control stuff. And just plug it in and let it run. That's what I want. Alright, let's do it. We have mono detail, 1 gram, half a gram, weigh it out, put it into our solvent. Here we already have our 10 mils of mostly DCM, a little bit of methanol. Hopefully it all dissolves in the solvent. That's an important step. Let's get it happening.
Wait, there is. I'm telling you, these two. I'm telling you, this is like fucking crazy. Why am I the crazy guy in the fucking horror movie that nobody believes? Penny, listen. Play again, right? Hit the Yoshi point.
Alright,
Me
that
get
dissolves
that
for
yoinky
a,
spoinky.
I would say perfectly clear solution. I've got one or two floaty bits in there. Always seem creepy because I'm doing things in the shed. So it's time to start the clock, I guess. Sure. Goodbye, have a good one. See you again in, I suppose, an hour or so. Right, it's been an hour, It's been a whole dang hour. Let's start and have a look. Nothing has changed. What am I expecting after an hour? I don't know. I'm going to have to, monitor this.
I don't think it can make that.
Nothing magical has happened after 1 hour. So, that's fine. Hey, cool.
What's up, bitches?
Maybe, who knows? Goodbye.
On my way.
Sorry, guys. That was
Point. Like the lawn. Get off the lawn. Stop eating the lawn.
Stupid. Oh, I see that friend out there. What are these guys doing? You guys having a little fight?
Yeah, I see it.
Good.
What am I expecting to see? A little warmer in here.
What's shitty? Peter and
I know what I'm doing. I just haven't got around to it. Hopefully after 2.5 hours. Oh, yeah, small now. Hey, my expectations is very low. So, in fact, if you follow up, hey, really get that. I'm already exceeding expectations. Alright, it's very late at night. I still haven't done it. Hey, I ran it for another 2 hours. It's fine. Alright, so I'm going to follow approaches. It's slightly off. Where's the switch? I'm basically right before another hour mark. Still subtle, but you know,
Why'd they go to
Here we are at the TLC station. I'm not that excited. TLC takes a lot of time, but it's the best way of monitoring reactions. Doing anything. We've got a few things to do before we make that stain. That's the last stain now. Online. And see it like crap. I've said that really like that stain anyway, so I'll just be making the stain to add that recipe. And someone posted in the comments. That big. Hillary tubes, we're using this DCM methanol mixture as an solution. Hopefully it works. It's the transfer class. Made last video. Hopefully there are you're just jumping for
anesthesiologists, surgeons, emergency medicine physicians, pain management specialists. We're the largest provider of doctors in the first-year U.S. residencies. St. George's University School of Medicine.
Good. Where's my sneak achievement? Is it because I threw a bat? Does that count? That's the only thing I can think of. Oh, big old bugs. They're not There's no danger. I am the danger. You can only get like regular runs, armored runs, and slashers.
goofing around. No more goofing around. Stop goofing around. It's been so much goofing around because people are goofing around too much. It's been so much goofing around. You have to be careful. It's over. If it's you again, I'm going to be very mad. It was ejected. But I didn't really look past the line. So I was right down kill him, I can't do it. Kill him. I don't know how to do it. Kill him. I don't know how to do it. Kill him. How do you do it? Dude, kill him. What? Don't believe a fucking word that is. This guy has killed me twice and each time he chased me around the cafeteria. He chased me around the cafeteria. Screaming at me.
Damn.
He's literally chasing me around the cafeteria.
The tan one here. Yeah.
That sounded like Porsche.
I've never seen one that I think it says it here. Yeah, they're just where'd it go? Where'd they go then? There's a lot of fucking going on. There's a shelter. Yeah, they're really red. Gotta watch my freaking breathing. Steve is dead.
Oh my god, look at all those funny hairs.
Items used. So just like be anywhere. So there's your answer. Be anywhere.
Based on 2-3, it seems like this is supposed to be like American and Canadian standard. This one.
I would be interstarving mode while you're I mean, like,